Alright, so I've decided to make a video on changing bearings in like an Amtech motor. This Amtech motor came out of a Filter Queen 112B, which is one of the green models. I think it's a limited edition model. Not that that matters too much, but in order to change bearings on one of these, it's easiest if you have an impact driver, but I figured a lot of people who are looking for a way to do this probably don't have one. So I'm going to show you guys what I refer to as my old technique, if you will. Um, what I used to do before I had the impact driver, because it is possible to disassemble motors like this, where you have you know, the carbon brush holders back here, and then you'll have some screws that allow you to disassemble the field coil. So I'm going to show you guys how I went through and changed bearings on these. There are some tools that you will need. First and foremost, you'll need a bearing puller of some sort. You need this to pull the old bearings off of it, because you really won't be able to do it. I've never really found a workaround for that, and until I had one of those, I couldn't do it. And then I also suggest having, this is just it's a split shaft collar, I think it was. And what this is used for is when you're installing a new bearing, you have to make sure that you're pushing on this center ring, and this is about the same size as that center ring. Because if you push on the outside, or if you push on this seal, you risk damaging the bearing. So it's very important that you're concentrating the strikes, because you'll most likely use a hammer when you're pressing the bearing onto the shaft. So if you just want to find something, I've actually used like old sockets, like from a socket wrench for it before, with a good amount of success. You just want to make sure it's about the size of the shaft, or I mean about the size of this inner ring, because you don't want to be pushing on the shield, you don't want to be pushing on the outside. But before you start disassembling your motor, it's often important to take note of where things are hooked up. Now, if you intend to take all the wires off here, sometimes what I have done is I've taken a Sharpie and written just a little bit on this plastic right here to tell me what wire went where. So for blue, I would write BL, and then for red, just like an R, and then we have a black one over here, so just B for that. Although in this case, it isn't necessary for me to take those wires off, so I'm not going to. But the first step will be to remove the carbon brush. On some of the newer ones, we'll actually have the carbon brushes encased in these plastic shells, and then this right here would actually just be a almost like a little retaining clip. But on here, it's also the connection from the motor, or from the field coil, to the carbon brushes. So we'll first start by removing these carbon brushes, because we need to access the screw that's underneath the carbon brushes. And this will be pretty standard for a lot of Amtech brand motors, and even some Demel motors. And you never want to lose track of your screws, so I find it easiest just to put them back with the object they came from. And if you're just looking to change carbon brushes, you just remove these brackets. This one's going to be a little stubborn, I guess. There we go. So then from there you give there's going to be a little tab on the underside of a carbon brush, whether it's old or new. So you want to give it a little bit of a lift, and then from there it should kind of spring out, because these are spring loaded. And as we can see, the carbon brushes are still nice and long, so lots of life left in them. And then under the carbon brushes, we have these bolts, and the bolts are generally 1/4 inch. So I just use this just like interchangeable screwdriver. So when both of these are loosened, we'll actually be able to pull the entire field coil off of here, as well as expose the rear bearing. Now I should mention, before you pull this off, you're going to want to be careful about the back bearing, because there is often there's almost like a round spring that is between the housing and the bearing itself. Oh, I guess this one doesn't have it. But there will often be a little metal spring in here, so when you're pulling it apart, you just want to watch out for that. And our rear bearing isn't, well, it feels a little dry. Yeah. It's often best, you know, if you're in to replace bearings, you should just replace both of them. What do we have here? Oh, see, look at that. I was wrong. It did have the spring. It fell out. So we want to make sure that this gets back into place. So we'll just put that with it for now. And now we have to work on getting this nut out of here. Now, if I were using the impact driver, I could have just put it on there and taken the nut right off. But like I said, I made this to show people how to do this without an impact driver, because I figured most people wouldn't have one. So what we're going to want to do here is, typically you want to wrap this in something, just mainly so you don't hurt your hand on it. But you want to grip around the silver part here. And a lot of the times these nuts are reverse threaded. So we're going to grip on the back part. Oh, this one is not. I can tell it tightened up a little bit. So we're going to loosen the nut from here, and then we're just going to give it a little bit of a wiggle while pulling back on this. Okay. We have our fan case now removed from here, and just like a lot of front bearings, this has a rubber cover over it, which you just remove that, and you'll want to reuse that. So now, as for the removal of the bearings, that's where we take this specialized tool, and we're first, well, it's always good to take note of where the bearings are. Generally in Amtex, they will be mounted to points like this. I don't know if you guys can see that very well. I mean, it's got a clear place where it stops, so you don't have to worry about spacing it, because it's going to have clear defined points for it where it can't slide down onto it anymore. But there will be some machines, you know, you work on that will not have anything to indicate where they went. And if your bearings are off, there's a good chance your fans are going to be rubbing, or something is just not going to work quite right. So it's always kind of important to make sure they get back to where they need to be. Okay. We'll just clamp that into there, and then we want to make sure it's fairly, and from there we just take this and we spin that in, and then the shaft will actually push down on the screw will push down onto the motor shaft, while these little claws have like a grasp on the, it doesn't look like it's fully on there. Okay, well, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to get under. The rear bearing is typically the problem. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to take two flathead screwdrivers, and we're just going to use that to push it away from the commutator, but you should be very, very careful about it when you're doing it. There we go. Now we've definitely got room. It always seems to be the rear bearing that you really have that problem with, because there's not a lot of room to get under there. Oh yeah, definitely now. So just rotate this until the bearing comes off. Okay, rear bearing's off. Now we'll take the front bearing, and depending on the size of the shaft on the front, sometimes it's a good idea. In this case, I'm not going to bother because we have kind of a concave right here on the front, almost a little conical shape, so it won't hurt it. But like when we're hammering on the back bearing, we're actually going to put the nut back on here just to protect the threads. But let's get that front one off, and then we'll go for the install. Okay. It's always going to be a little bit of a hassle to get it to break free. That snapping sound is normal. That's just the bearing coming loose from its position. And after a certain point, it's normal for them just to kind of slide off. Now sometimes I'll take just a real light sandpaper, just a really, really fine grit, and clean up this space a little bit. It sometimes makes getting a new one on a little bit easier. But I see I have some steel wool, just the quadruple zero grade, so that'll do fine for that. So we're just going to clean up the shaft a little bit. And if your shaft is rusty on them, it's an especially good idea to do that. Okay. Now we're going to start by putting the front bearing on first. And I think that's a good idea to do here because the rear bearing is like flush with the end of the shaft. And you know, it's like I said, you don't want to put any pressure on the outside of the bearings if you can help it. So the bearings I use are HCH brand ones. I get them on eBay from a company called JS Great Bearings. They've seemed to work pretty well for me. I really do not recommend getting just generic ones that are unbranded and just say skateboard ball bearings, because I mean, I've had a lot of those fail. And it seems like if you at least go with a brand name, you know, even a less expensive one like HCH, the failure rate on the bearings is going to be a lot less than like those. And those just don't seem to hold up, those skateboard ones. But these, I mean, I haven't really used the machines. I've replaced bearings in enough to know what they're going to be like in the long term. But I haven't seen any of them fail yet. And then this is something I use in conjunction with this little shaft collar, and this is just to allow me to get further down onto a longer shaft like this. I think I need my other one. Yep, there we go. I've got two of these. This one's a little bit wider, and then this one's a little bit, well, one side's a little wider than the other. I think it kind of got unevenly bent over its usage. So like that one side's a little more open, the other side's a little more closed. But anyways, it's always a good idea just to make sure your bearings are smooth before you start to put them on. You know, because I mean, even with these, you know, you'll sometimes have a dud right out of the package. So we have our bearing on there. We've got the we've got that pressed on where it is not going to be putting weight on the shield or the outside of it. And we're just going to kind of press down on it, and then we're just going to tap this until it meets. We don't want to sit there and like really beat on this thing, but I mean just some firm. We're almost there. It's getting very close. There we go. Front one's on. It's spinning fine. Always a good idea to check that out, because occasionally, if you haven't done this correctly and you do end up putting pressure on the outside of it, you might find that once you get the bearing on here, it's not spinning well. If that's the case, you may need to remove it and start over. But now with that front one on, we put the nut back on the front so it's flush, or about flush, just so we're not damaging the threads on that. Now we'll take our back bearing and we'll give that a little bit of a press just to make sure it's on there okay. And then I think we'll switch that out because this one's a little more heavy duty. So press down and that one went on a lot easier, but we're not quite there. And now we are. And just like that, our motor has new ball bearings on it. And now, you know, I know this really isn't bearing related, but I'm going to take apart the fan case on this because I like to get those cleaned out. You know, over time they do definitely build up. And let's just give this a little. It's not that bad actually. So you can take the fan case apart, you know, while it's still attached, but I mean, you're best off, you know, getting the nut off of here at very least. Because I mean, it seems like oftentimes when you're trying to take these apart, it's the back section that'll want to slide away first. And this one in particular is a dual stage, so we actually have multiple shells, but we'll try to remove this first shell first. So pressure on a flathead screwdriver. Sometimes I use a square one, a screwdriver. I don't know what those are called. We're just going to give it a few taps, rotate it a little bit, and we'll often find that these do not like to come apart very well. So sometimes a lot of time and patience is required in order to get these apart. look like it's coming a little bit. It's always the first part of it that seems to be the most difficult. We're coming up on the sticker again. Okay, now we're definitely getting somewhere because we can see it's separated right there. So now we just continue to go around. And there we go. So here's our front fan. And you'll want to take note of how your fan stages are assembled. Now, clearly it's very dirty in here. So I'm going to put these in a bath of warm water and just dish soap. And then I have these tube brushes that I like to use in order to clean the fans out, and they're just fantastic for that. I bought like a set of those, and then I suppose I should show you guys what I'm doing. So there are these kind of a crimp point back here. So what I'm doing is I'm going around to the ones that are crimped in, and I'm just bending them back out so that they do not get in the way when we attempt to remove the shell. Now some of them are a little tighter than others, so I might have to use a smaller screwdriver. And it's like with these, typically I like to switch to that square-ended screwdriver I was talking about, because it seems like, you know, if we distribute the force on it a little bit more, you know, it's less likely to kind of cut into this versus the flathead. So anyways, same type of thing, except in this case you're going to stick to these openings in here, the former crimping points, until you have the until you have it moved away from the plastic body. And some cat's chattering. He doesn't like when I do this. It seems to want to go more under this than, you know, through it, so I'll have to bring the angle. Okay, yeah, we're starting to move this. Yep, we're starting to get a separation between this plastic lip and the metal itself. You know, sometimes I've taken a flathead and I just put it in between them and given it a twist, but if your motor is on the older side, you'll risk damaging this plastic lip. So I kind of try to avoid that now if I can, especially if I know I'm working with something older, which I think this was, I think it was a late 90s machine, so it's like, let's not test it. And then if you're far enough out on here, sometimes you can just pull it apart, but we don't seem to be in that kind of range where we can do that yet. Although now maybe. So we're just gonna, and if your separation is far enough, but you're not quite able to get them, if you're not quite able to get it, you can come up here onto the plastic, but over the lip, and then just, does not want to stay put. Okay, this would be better done with a flathead. We're just not getting in there enough with the square-shaped one. See, now we're definitely making some progress on this. Okay. All right, so we're usually going to have a piece like this, and this will sit on the last stationary stage, and this pushes, you know, it'll actually sit on the inner piece of the bearing, and it keeps, you know, the stationary parts away from this. And then we'll have a fan. There will sometimes be a washer here, but if you have one that's flared out like this, you generally won't find a washer. So then you'll have a fan. Sometimes you'll have a washer and then a spacer, but these act as kind of a 2-in-1. So we'll just have this, another fan, and then you will almost always have a washer right before the nut. So that's how this motor went together. It's very important that you do get it back together in the right order. And then of course you have your stationary stages. And I'm going to pause the video for a moment while I go wash these out.